Okay, it is Diwali evening, Wednesday, 18 October. Of course, in different places in India, Diwali is celebrated on different days, right? Isn't that true,
Ye-
Samya?
Yes, that's true.
In Bangalore, are most people celebrating it today?
No, they're celebrating it tomorrow evening and Friday.
Ah, ha, ha, ha. But I think here in Chennai, tonight is the biggest night for fireworks. And so you'll probably hear from my side firecrackers going off. But anyway, so here we are, and Philip may join us in a while, and we're recording especially for Philip and Vaishali, who are not with us right now. So, so let's begin. Um, yeah, I was just saying to Trisha that I really enjoyed the version of the Pinocchio story that she sent in. And I personally related to the theme of that a character begins thinking for only about his own pleasures and desires and satisfaction, but by the end, kind of learns his lesson and is more concerned about the people who love him. And by the end, he learns to discriminate between helping people who are going to abuse him as opposed to helping people who love him. Right? The fox and the cat take advantage of him at least once, and then they ask for his help after that. But by the end, he doesn't give them help. He saves. He has a certain amount of help to give, and he saves it for his father, his stepfather. So I like that story. It had a very clear theme for me. But the idea is, Trisha, that where each one of us is collecting 5 or 6 or 7 stories from different realms of experience. This is I guess Pinocchio, it's a folk tale, although it may have an individual author. You know, in the field of folklore, we make a distinction between stories that really are made up by a community and passed down, as opposed to stories that are written by an individual author. But there's really not so much of a distinction sometimes when a story is written by an individual, but it's becomes so beloved by various communities that it's then passed down even orally. And Pinocchio is a story like that. So so Pinocchio's there. It's in your bag of stories. You can get 5 or 6 or 7 other stories, including, I would suggest, you're so involved with theater. Who are your heroes in the theater? For example, who do you in theater and cinema? What directors or writers do you really look up to? Anything occur to you immediately, Trisha?
Um, no, the theater part isn't helpful because I'm like a complete anomaly in the theater community because mostly what I do is like storytelling based or social justice work. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't spend a lot of time with musical theater or conventional plays. I adapt stories and original work for the stage in a way that's theatrical, but it's not
But
typical.
in the field of social theater or social storytelling, do you have any heroes or heroines whose work you feel you're following up on, and who you're inspired by?
Um, yeah, I really like the work of Ping Chong, who is a Chinese American that grew up in the Chinese theater in New
Mm-hmm.
York City. I mean, in the Chinese opera. His
Mm-hmm.
family was all involved in Chinese opera,
Mm-hmm.
and his work is especially inspiring to me.
Did you read that person's autobiography, or how do you know the person's life story?
No, he's still alive.
Mm-hmm.
I know his life story because I've met him.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, you know, there may be something about his life story that you find inspiring. and or there may be something in one of his works. I guess he's a writer and director.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there may be something in one of his works that you especially relate to and hold dear. So that's one area. Another area is historical figures. Just anywhere, things that your friends have been through. Favorite movies, books. Just gather more stories that mean something to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. At first, I thought it was supposed to be exclusively folk tales, and so I was struggling with that a little bit.
Yeah, no, one or two folk tales is good.
Okay.
And Salmi, how are you doing with stories, collecting stories?
Well, like I had sent quite a few to you.
Mm-hmm.
This week I have not really thought of more stories. I think I had put down quite a bit. So I have not added to it. But I wanted to clarify one thing. I have identified a person who would like to work with me. So so I would like to start, and we are midway. And is it okay? Can I start working with this person?
Sure. Now, is it on the grounds that the person is engaging in therapy, or the person, or engaging in coaching? Are you being a psychological counselor, or are you being a coach, or something else?
Something else. Actually, she's part of my. I'm going for a course on counseling skills specifically.
Mm-hmm.
She's part of that course, and she's just interested. She's just somebody who said she will participate in this and is willing to be my, to come as my a person who I can work with. She's not specifically looking for coaching or counseling. She's willing to explore the whole idea of using storytelling. That is all.
Okay. Well, first of all, you have an MPhil in psychology, right?
Yes.
So we don't have to be shy about saying that if you want to do counseling with people, you can.
Okay.
In the States, there's a whole licensing process to be a mental health worker. But in India, there's not. In India, it's just really you should have a master's degree or higher, and then one can consider oneself a psychological counselor. Okay, so she's a colleague of yours, a co-student of yours in a training program,
Yes.
and you're teaching her this method. But for this assignment, you also are supposed to practice this method on someone, or help a person practice this method on themselves. So let's think of what you're doing with her as more on the coaching side or the personality development side, that you're helping her, you're helping her with her self-development. Is that okay? Do you think she would be okay with that?
I think that should be fine. Yes.
Good.
But I will need to clarify. I'm planning to set up the first meeting this weekend. Mm-hmm. And I'll have to find out if she's okay with the intention mm-hmm. of the session.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question to me. That my feeling is that one can be a coach or even a psychological counselor and train a person in the method at the same time. And I know that, in the upper levels of training of psychoanalysis, the person who's being trained as a psychoanalyst also undergoes psychoanalysis. And I'm sure that they are, learning, being taught the method and learning the method as the method is also being, as they are also experiencing the method and using the method on themselves. So that's a sort of question of mine, which is not, I haven't had a definitive answer yet, whether it's ethical to feel one is teaching a method and conducting therapy with a person at the same time. I don't see why there should be a conflict about it, but I need to discuss this with people who have more experience as a therapist.
So I personally feel the intention is not to teach her the method, but that is going to happen because once we once I go through the whole, the methodology, the 8 steps, then automatically there's going to be some transfer of learning that's going to happen. But I do see it as personal coaching. There is one thing that I must mention here. I don't know if it's relevant or not, but she is a visually impaired person. So for me, just working with her would be a great experience is my take on that. So whether she's going to take it as a training or I'm not positioning it as a training program with her.
What are you positioning it as?
So like you just mentioned, it is more for personality development and a self-awareness, a self-building sessions.
Good. That's fine. And you're meeting with her in person, right? You're not meeting with her electronically. Is that correct?
Yes. So I wanted to clarify that. So I intend to meet with her in person. I think since this is very new for me, I didn't want to do it over the phone. I will be meeting her in person.
Good. Good. Is she like 90% blind or completely blind, or you have a sense of what it is?
She is completely blind. There is some amount of, I think, perception of light, but she is completely blind.
Yes, I'm sure it'll be interesting to work with her. I often, I often close my eyes when I talk and listen because I like to be able to concentrate on the words and the sound without visual distraction. And I've also worked with some blind people, and I enjoyed it very much because they were blind. I also felt free to close my eyes, and it worked for me. Good. Okay, good. So I'm glad you found someone, and just check with her. So the point is that you're happy to teach her this method, but what you need is someone who's volunteering to undergo the process so that you afterwards can assess how you practiced these methods on a person and how that person benefited from it or didn't benefit from it, or how the person found it useful or did not find it useful. Tricia, do you have anyone in mind to work with?
I am talking with someone about the potential, but we're just trying to figure out if there's the time and the space for it.
Good. One reason I'm suggesting this is that the best way to learn a method is to teach it to somebody else and to practice it on somebody else. We're already you're already practicing it on yourself and in a very mild way on each other in this course, but it'll help if you can also practice it on an outside person. So again, you're gathering a number of stories and then playing with both your the person's life story and these other stories. Playing in the sense of if you want to change the ending, if you want to add characters, if you want to talk to the characters, if you want to talk as the characters, any which way to work with the stories, including their component parts, including the outstanding themes, turning points, and motifs. Now, I've been using this word motif. Are you both pretty clear on it? It's a simple thing. It's just an element of a story. Are you both comfortable with this term motif? And it relates to Jung's thinking about archetypes, that motifs, especially if they recur again and again, especially if you have some emotional connection with that object or with a character like that, it might be considered an archetype, which means it's not only recurring in your life again and again, but it's recurring again and again in the culture. And it's an important aspect of the collective conscious and collective unconscious. Okay, there's that quote that I like about how getting in touch with these archetypes, recognizing them in one's own life, it's you synchronize your heartbeat to the rhythm of the universe, to speak in a grandiose way. Okay, so turning points, archetypal motifs, themes, talking to characters, talking as characters. I mentioned, I might have mentioned at the beginning weeks ago that I participated in a workshop recently where the leader had us sit in a circle, and we all knew the story. He had each one of us dress up as different characters in the story and different objects at different stages of the story. So there was the young woman, the older woman, you know, as she grew older, different people played her, and they were sitting in different places in the circle. So then when then the process was that we went around the circle and we didn't act out the story, but the younger characters, or the characters who appeared at the beginning, had a chance to talk to themselves in an older state. And the older characters had a chance to talk to themselves in a younger state. So what I'm saying is you can talk to any character in any story as they are, or a younger version of themselves. And out of this whole mix and play, hopefully, and thinking about metaphors, Philip is joining us, and playing with metaphors, hopefully out of this whole thing, what emerges is at least one fantasy story for yourself, for the client, which kind of encapsulates. Good morning, Philip.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir. How are you? How are you?
I'm fine.
Are you at home, or are you traveling?
No, I had to go to a Wi-Fi spot. My home Wi-Fi wouldn't work.
So are you at a cafe, or where are you?
I'm at the local grocery store.
Oh, God bless. Well, I hope you get a little snack to justify your existence there.
Well, I shop here all the time, so I think I can justify my existence here.
Very good, very good. Okay, we were just reviewing the therapy or self-development process, and I was saying that the story at the end, it's like you're cooking with a lot of things that you've chopped up and put in this broth or soup or stew, and the aroma that arises from the whole thing, that's a symbolic way of saying we're hoping an inspirational story arises out of that mix.
Yes, sort of like the old story Stone Soup.
That's right. That's right. There are different people put different things into it, and everyone enjoys the mix. Similar idea, but here one person are putting different stories in, including your life story, including these other stories, and the synthesis and the aroma arising is going to be your metaphorical fantasy healing or inspirational story for yourself, or if you're facilitating this with a client, for the client. So Saumya and Trisha were telling about their plans to do this process with a client, whether it's a counseling client or someone they're coaching, or someone they're helping with that person's self-development. Do you have an individual or a group in mind who you might work with?
Oh yeah, I'm sure I could do something with somebody at the hospital. I'm sure I could get permission to do that. I can't think of what individual or group that might be, but yeah, I'm sure I could do that.
With a patient or a staff member?
Either one, really. I just have to talk to them about it.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, I could easily do that. Sure.
You know, you have the in this field with this material, you can present it either that it's you're offering free therapy to someone,
Yeah.
Or you're offering to coach them for their self-development, which
Sure.
which does not involve healing, does not involve trauma. It's just you know, self-development facilitation, self-actualization facilitation.
We have a lot of interns. One of them might be interested in it.
That's right. And along the way, they would get trained in the method, but the primary point of
Right.
the interaction would not be to train them, but that they are volunteering to be a subject
Right.
in the course of your training, that your training requires that you practice the method on somebody else.
Right.
Great.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with getting somebody to do it. No problem. Yeah.
Great. Okay, you might have noticed an email that I sent about an hour ago in response to a private email that Vaishali sent to me, that she has a family issue and has to travel to New Delhi tonight and has to be there for some time. So we're recording tonight for her. Is that okay?
Sure.
Great. Okay, and we'll just make the recording available to the five of us. And she said she'll be there at least 2 weeks without, and she doesn't know if she'll have internet connection, and she's not sure if she'll join us afterwards. But anyway, we'll see as it comes. Okay, so the other agenda for tonight was let's see. I said we were going to look over Vaishali's stories, and I think we should. We should just take a glance at them, even though she's not here. And then all these readings. I have to really apologize that that we've kind of fallen behind on going through the readings. Usually when I teach, I'm very definite that if a reading is assigned, we have to go over it and get closure on it that week. But somehow that has not been happening. For one thing, these sessions are 90 minutes once a week, and I think, you know, surely we should keep it that way because that's how we scheduled it, and that's our plan. But really, college classes that meet once a week usually meet for 3 hours with a break. So the fact that we're doing both academic study and personal process also takes up a lot of time, but we'll muddle through. Okay, so did anyone, Samia, you had a chance to look at Vaishali's stories, I think, right? Because you sent
Yes.
the email about it. Tricia or Philip, did you have a chance to glance?
Not
I
me.
didn't.
Okay, I have them here. I hope I can find them here. Oh no, you know, I have to get them from the other room. I'll be right back.
So, Samia, tell me about this holiday that's happening.
Holiday, Diwali. Oh, Diwali is quite a festival here. With Eric.
Hmm? Philip, what's that blue thing in front of you?
Blue thing.
Headphones.
Oh, it's the headphones.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, one of my big fears is that with these earphones, sometimes like I'm having a snack while I'm using these headphones, and my big fear is that I'm going to do this.
Oh yeah.
Has anyone ever done that?
I don't know. I bought some earbuds a while back and ripped them right out of the package and ripped them right in half. So that was $5 down the drain.
Okay, so she sent how many? Four stories that I found a common theme in. The first story is a true friend about a boy in school who he has a friend who is diagnosed with a learning disability, and this friend has to go to some special classes. So his friend says he's going to go to the special classes also, just to keep his friend company. And then the second one is titled Food Drive, and it's about a boy at school who works in a, what's it called when people are giving away food? A pantry? What's that called?
Yeah, food pantry.
Food pantry for community, neighborhood generosity and support. And someone, I guess his mother also works in that food pantry, and he's helping out his mother. And while he's there one day, one of his classmates comes in from school. And this classmate had been acting very angry lately and unfriendly and tough. And the boy who's volunteering at the food pantry sees this boy who's been acting angry. And, okay, Derek is the boy who was working at the pantry. Now I'm reading. Derek was surprised because he had no idea that Robbie's family was in a rough spot. Derek began to sympathize with Robbie and understand why Robbie had been appearing aggravated and had been keeping to himself. So the boy who was working in the pantry really had compassion for the boy who was coming in with his family, and that seemed to better their relationship. Then the third one was about all the birds, and I think this one, Samuel, you asked which ones of these really happened and which one were stories about other characters. This one I think really happened. That there was a crow. There are a lot of birds outside Vaishali's house, and one type of bird is a crow pheasant, which it seems it's a type of pheasant, or maybe it's a type of crow, but it's a big bird, and babblers were much smaller birds, maybe like sparrows. And what happened one day was that a snake came into the area, the garden, and the big crow pheasant was really determined to push the snake away and save the little birds. So Vaishali was really impressed with how that crow pheasant was so dedicated and determined and wasn't worried about eating food, but just wanted to chase away the snake and save her friends. And then the fourth was about a cosmetic surgeon and his wife. I think his wife is also a doctor in rural India. The gist of the story is that they do a lot of charity work, but they do work that people can't pay them for. And then one of their patients has a wedding. And they come to the wedding, but they get there late, partly because they had to do medical work that day. They get there late at night. And when they get there, they are surprised to hear, somebody says, okay, let's start the ceremony now. But it's like 8 or 9 at night. And they're surprised that the ceremony is only starting at 8 o'clock at night. But someone says to them, I think actually the groom, who had been a patient of one of them, the groom says to them, well, we could not start the wedding without you here, because you're like my father. So the two husband and wife doctor were very impressed and very, touched that they were considered almost like a member of the family, and that the ceremony had been delayed until they came. So do any of you see a common element in all these stories? What do you see, Tricia?
Oh, loyalty and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Acceptance and solidarity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I said to her about the boy who worked in the food pantry. In some cases, with some people, the boy who worked in the food pantry might make fun of the boy who was coming in whose family had no money. But in this case, the boy who was working in the food pantry certainly did not respond that way. He did not bully. He did not pick on. He only felt sympathy for the boy who was coming, and that caused the boy who was coming to relax and be less angry. So that was a nice. That was a good ending. All right. Any other thoughts about any of those stories? Again, it was a true friend who goes to the remedial classes with his friend. It reminds me, it's said of Native American people that when they have a race, they'll, at least in the old days, the participants would time it that they would all finish together. They would all cross the finish line at the same time, because that seemed to be the proper way to run a race. You know, not to determine a winner and a loser, but for everyone to do it together.
Yeah, I think to get more specific about the term inclusion, there's a real like egalitarian or equality embedded in all the stories.
Mm-hmm.
Altruism or equality that even with the pheasant like standing up for the others.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like that's the joining theme.
And with the doctors, oh, go ahead, Philip. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I'm going to be at the children's unit tonight, and I'm doing 2 Native American tales, and they both have that theme of equanimity to them. They both feature that idea of all men being equal and group effort and group activity being the way to bring about the best results.
And I've been hearing that saying lately a number of times. It's an African saying, I think, that if you want to travel fast, go alone. But if you want to travel a long distance, go in a group. Has anyone heard that?
Yes, I have, and that's something that we constantly reflect upon in PSS. Sorry for bringing that up. But yes.
So, go ahead.
No, what stories are you telling, Philip? I would like to know.
The first one will be a story of Dashkaya, which is the female counterpart of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and it has to do with a boy who's by himself in the forest, and Dashkaya comes out of the forest and offers him a handful of berries, and when he goes for them, she slaps pine tar in his face and carries him off to bake him in her bonfire with 9 other little children, because that's what she eats for dinner. And he starts to think about the last time he felt good that day, and it was when he chanted a prayer to the sun, because it felt so good on his skin. So he thought that he would lean into the fire instead of recoiling away from it. So he leans into the fire, and he notices that the pine sap starts to melt out of his eyes, and pretty soon he can see Dashkaya dancing around the bonfire. So he nudges the little girl next to him, and he says, "Lean into the fire," and she does, and the pine sap melts out of her eyes, and he tells her to nudge the little boy next to her, and so on, around the 10 little children, and pretty soon all of them have the wax melted out of their eyes. They can all see Dashkaya dancing around the fire, and so he says, "Now, when I say go, push her into the fire," and they push her into the fire. But Dashkaya doesn't burn like a fire log. She burns like firecrackers on the 4th of July, and she bursts into 1,000,000 sparks. But those sparks, when they hit the ground, they turn into 1,000,000 mosquitoes. And that's why mosquitoes still drink the blood of little children to this very day. Now, this sounds like a really horrific story, but this I got from the Healing Hearts book, edited by Allison Cox, and there's 3 really good lessons here that you process with the children. One is that you lean into your problems instead of running away from them. 2 is you get help with your problems, like the young man did with his 10 compatriots in the same problem, And the 3rd is, and you have one really big problem, like a 9-foot monster, you break it down into lots of little problems that you can swat away, like the 1,000,000 mosquitoes. So that's one story, Dashkaya. The other one is a story that my friend, the Choctaw teller, Tim Tingle, tells, and he has a book, and you can get it, and it's beautifully illustrated. It's called Crossing Bokchito, which is spelled Bokchitto. Tim Tingle is the teller, and he's an official Choctaw teller. And I just give you the basic bones of the story. Basically, this is based on the truth. Of course, he embellishes it quite a bit. But the ancestral land of the Choctaw was in the Mississippi Valley before the Trail of Tears, when they were carried away to Oklahoma by the federal government. And their ancestral land was on the Bokchito River. And the Bokchito River bordered many large plantations where many slaves were held. And the slaves came to realize that if they could cross the Bokchito River and get to the Choctaw Nation, the Choctaws would accept them and adopt them into the Choctaw tribe. And the plantation owners could not take them back as slaves, which is part of the reason why the federal government took the Choctaw and the other Indians off to Oklahoma. And so that's the basis of the story. And I would highly recommend you get that book, because I'll be telling it the way Tim tells it, and he tells it in a beautiful way. And again, it's a story about racial equality and about group effort and how people, when they get together, make miraculous things happen.
Yes.
So those are 2 stories I'll be telling.
Yes, you know, because of the theory of evolution and the idea of survival of the fittest, that sometimes justifies people into saying only individuals matter, and it's survival of the fittest, dog eat dog. But there's also a lot to be said for teamwork, and that people and animals who do practice teamwork, it may help their chances for survival and growth. So those are kind of competing ideas. whether the individual is the most important or whether teamwork is most important. Obviously, both are important, but it's good to have stories and awareness of the importance of togetherness and teamwork to balance the situation. Good. So so you might
Samia,
want. Go ahead. Yes,
Samia,
Trisha.
were you gonna say something?
No, I just wanted to know the name of that story, the second story. I didn't get that.
Okay, it's Crossing Bok Chito. BOKCHITTO. And it's by Tim Tingle. TINGILE. And he has published that in a book form that is very beautifully illustrated, also by a Native American illustrator. It's a great book.
Okay, so you might want to put, Philip, you might want to put one or both of those stories in your collection. I'm suggesting that each of us make a kind of story bag, to use a metaphor, and we're collecting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories from folk tales, from historical stories, from things I heard my friend did, our favorite movies, of these other stories that somehow ring a bell and we relate to, and it relates to a theme in our life story. So you might want to include 1 or 2 of those. And also, I saw on Storytel this week, somebody was asking, or on Healing Story Alliance, somebody was asking for stories relating to the floods and the fires, or the hurricanes, and you mentioned the magic flute.
Yeah, I did. I suggested the magic flute because the hero and heroine have to pass through fire, water, and wind in order to attain the flood and overcome the queen of the night. And
you either retold the story in a nice way or you gave a link to a nice retelling of it. So I suggest
somebody else jumped in and gave the link, but yeah.
But I suggest to keep that story in mind also as one of your supporting stories.
Well, yeah, that story made a deep impression on me. I saw it on the stage, but I still remember the story. It's a great story.
Good. Okay, shall we take a little bit of touching up on some of these readings, so at least we can feel that we're caught up or catching up.
Sure.
Okay. The first one we've discussed a good deal. That was the story and storytelling in storytelling therapy and expressive arts therapy. And the second one was fairy tale therapy. And one thing I wanted to mention about that was elements of fairy tales include that there's often a very good, kind character as opposed to a really wicked character. The duality is very extreme and pronounced. You know, in real life, we have good and bad within us. But in fairy tales, usually there's a good character who is, really suffers because of a bad character. So look for those motifs of extreme good, extreme bad, and suffering. And because of all the suffering, then wishing. And the wishes are granted, the wishes come true because the good character was so good. The good character was kind to old people, to crippled people. Somehow she was selfless. She did not look at the clock. She did not worry about getting paid. She did not worry about getting her hands dirty. She did not count the pages when she was reading a book. She just gave of herself. And as a result, somehow Mother Nature gives back to her through the form of a fairy godmother or anything else. And snap, she's got her treasure and her spouse, and she's going to live happily ever after. So just if you feel an inclination to make a metaphorical fairy tale version of your own life story or of elements of your life, keep these motifs in mind. A really innocent, kind character as opposed to the mean one, and the suffering, and then the wishing, and the dreams and the wishes come true.
I feel like sometimes it's not. Oh, I feel like sometimes it's not a bad thing to put someone in the role of being the bad person, because that might be the medicine that they need. I mean, especially to ask women to imagine themselves as innocent and vulnerable and give. It's like, I think a lot of young women, they need to be the bitch, and they need to be bad.
And one example of that is that story about the girl who loses a golden ball in a pond or a well. She's a princess, and the ball goes down, and then the frog brings it up and says, "I'll give you back your ball if you let me eat off your plate and sleep in your bed." And she says, "Oh, please just give me back the ball. I'll promise you anything." So she gets back the ball and she runs home, and she thinks he'll never catch up with her, he'll never find her. But he gets to the palace. He knocks on the door. He explains to her father that she had promised that he could eat on her plate. So the frog is permitted into the royal dining hall and climbs on a table and sits on the princess's plate and eats her food. And then when she goes to bed, she promised that frog could sleep in her bed. And she says, "Father, I don't want that frog." But the father said, "You promised." So the frog goes into her bed, and then she just picks it up and throws it hard against the wall. And as it slides down the wall, it transforms into the handsome prince. That is one version, an authentic version. Which somehow, it validates female rage of being, taken advantage of. So, yes, the female should not always be, go along with what the male says, but, well, okay, how do you respond? Another version of that story, of course, is that she just kisses the frog, and the frog turns into a prince. But there is a version where she slams him against the wall. I guess you prefer the version. I prefer the version where she slams him against the wall. How do you feel?
I mean, there's completely different gender dynamics going on back then when those stories were popular. I guess my point is just that some stories can be healing that aren't necessarily like all romantic and roses and innocent. They can still, some people might, like, for instance, I know this woman whose father was a minister, and she is a burlesque dancer, and it's like in her spare time. She's also a very successful scientist, but in her spare time, she's a burlesque dancer.
Wow.
And she, like, in my eyes, it's amazing because that's her way of having this antidote to so much repression when she was growing up, and so many expectations of her being this like perfect little angel of a good girl. And now, she's an extremely successful, powerful woman, but she has this medicine that is like performing as a dancer. So yeah, I think different judgments apply to different situations of what it is that people need through stories and play and through imagination in order to bring balance.
Well, when I say there's often a good character in a fairy tale, I don't mean goody-goody, and I don't mean submissive, but kind, and generous. That usually is there. What were you going to say, Philip?
I was just going to say that that there's been a lot of rewriting of fairy tales in recent years
Sure.
because of things like feminism. You know, like for instance, in Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods, there's a Cinderella thread that runs through it. There's 4 different fairy tales that run through that musical, and one of them's the Cinderella thread.
Mm-hmm.
And in his Cinderella thread, after she gets the prince, she runs away a second time. And while she runs away, he has a dalliance in the woods with another woman. And she finds out about it because the birds tell her that he's had a dalliance with another woman.
Mm-hmm.
And when she confronts him about it, his response is, well, my parents raised me to be charming, not sincere. You know, this is a modern conveyance, right? This is not something that the Grimms would have ever thought about writing.
Mm-hmm.
So we bring these things to our modern notions of these things. And I think that's great. And of course, there's a whole new movement. I can't even remember what they call it, but there's a whole new movement to write modern fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a specific name for it, but I can't remember what it is right now. And there's people out there writing great modern fairy tales all over the place right now, and they're wonderful. And
some of them call it fractured fairy tales.
Well, that was when what was that cartoon? Peabody
Bullwinkle.
the dog. Yes,
Yeah,
Bullwinkle, Rocky and Bullwinkle show had episodes with Peabody was a dog and he owned a boy, and then there were also these fractured fairy tales.
Yeah, those were wonderful. Those were based on the old fairy tales. But you know, I go to the storytelling conventions and the festivals every year, and there's some young people out there that are producing some great modern fairy tales. And like I said, they have a specific name for it. I can't remember the name of it, and they're wonderful. They're just great.
Yeah, but they're
modeled after the old ones. They sound like the old ones, but it's obvious with themes that they're not the old ones. You know, they're modern. There
are also traditional folktales around the world which feature a very proactive female figure who is kind and good, but also no pushover. One of my favorite Tamil folktales. It's not a fairy tale because there's nothing magical or supernatural in it, but there's a young lady who likes a certain man who her father disapproves of. And her father is the king. So her father, forbids her to spend any time with this young man. But the father, being king, has to travel on business and go around. So while he's out of station, his daughter meets with the young man. And the king hears about it. So the king writes a letter which he sends back to the chief of police saying, put this young man to death. But the courier is a friend of the princess. So he takes the letter to the princess and says, Princess, what to do? So she says, no problem. And she takes a pen and Tricia and Philip, you don't know Tamil, but the consonants have symbols and then different squiggles are put on them to represent different vowels with that consonant. So in other words, if there's a hook, that's like the I sound. If there's some other symbol after the consonant, it's a sound, like that. So what she does, she adds a few hooks and diddle-daddles to the letter, using the same color ink. And by the time she's finished, it says, have this young man marry my daughter. So in other words, she has forged a letter. And she gives it to the courier takes it to the chief of police, and the chief of police can't believe it because he knows the king doesn't approve of this young man, but there it is in black and white. So the wedding is performed. And then when the king comes back and finds that his daughter and this young man have married, he's obviously very angry. And he goes to the chief of police and says, what in the world? And the chief of police shows him the letter. And the king goes to his daughter, does an investigation and talks to the courier, talks to his daughter. And I often leave it up to the audience to think about what will the king do? Will he put his daughter to death? Will he put the young man to death? Will he forgive her? The ending that I like is that he has a minister who asks to speak with him privately, and the minister says, "King, both you and your daughter are very strong-willed. You are both, you have similar characters. So you ordered this boy should be killed. That was very strong. And then she turned it in that she should be married to him. That was also very strong. So, so can you forgive her because she's so much like you?" This is not an actual historical story. And I forget, when I heard it or read it, I forget how it ended. But I usually end it with a discussion like this. But that's a story. That's an example of a folktale, which the young female character is, she's totally she takes control of things. Anyway, for a fairy tale, it seems that usually, or at least the Western fairy tale, there is a period of suffering that the character goes through, and then wishes, hoping, dreaming, and somehow the dream comes true, and the character escapes the suffering. So see if that relates to your life in any way. In real life, we often create our own problems. We are often our own worst enemy. But in stories, there's often an external villain. And so when we make metaphorical stories, we often project aspects of ourselves, negative aspects of ourselves, onto external figures and objects. So see if you want to do anything like that. Anybody else have any thoughts about this fairy tale therapy essay, or about fairy tale therapy in general? Fairy tale therapy is one subsection within storytelling therapy.
I thought sorry, go ahead, Samia.
No, please.
I just wanted to make a comment that I thought the last part was interesting about the fairy tale therapy seminar that's in Portugal. I was really interested in that, and I looked at pictures of the that druid well and stuff. Or I don't know what it's called, but yeah, can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's Sintra is a hill station. It's in the mountains, and the climate is very pleasant. The air is fresh and cool, and partly because of that, and partly because there's so many castles, some of them refurbished from medieval times, it has become a resort area for the creative class. If any of you relate to that term, a lot of people hold seminars there and retreats in yoga, in personality development, in meet the goddess within, and actually it has a connection with the Greek and Roman goddess of the forest. I mentioned that in the end, where I think Athena, she has various names. Is it Athena or is it, wait a minute. Artemis. Well, one is the Greek name, one is the Roman name. Another one of her names is Cynthia. Yeah. Sintra in Portugal, it seems, according to one legend, is one of the 20 or 25 mountain areas that Zeus gave to Artemis, or Diana. Another of her, I think her original name is Diana, because Artemis, Cynthia, Diana loves the forest, and so her father gave her the these various forest places. And so the divine feminine is alive there, and there are statues of Artemis Diana, including one in the lobby of the hotel where the conference was held. I think that I give that link in the paper even. So I was very interested in that. I think I've mentioned that a lot of goddess lore, when goddess worship was made against the law in Europe, a lot of goddess lore kind of went underground into fairy tales. And you know, my teacher, Laura Sims, she said something on Storytel some time back to the effect that fairy tales, and maybe it was even broader, but she said it's all about the feminine element, and about how in the real world, the feminine element, or women, but the feminine element is often abused, ignored, undervalued, you know, considered without value. But fairy tales are about the showing about how the female element is essential. So you know, I don't know exactly how we define the female element, but that statement was very evocative for me.
Well, I call it shadow side.
The shadow.
Shadow side.
The shadow, the unconscious. You know, in psychology, there's this whole duality between the male element and the female element, where the male is consciousness and rigid. The female is unconscious and flexible. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with men and women, but it's this theoretical set of dualities that is sometimes used. So
like
yes. So I think there'll be. Go ahead.
Anima.
That's right.
Anima.
That's right. So I think the third annual seminar was last April, and they'll probably have another one this coming April. It's a little undefined what it's all about, because it's not put together by therapists or specialists in fairy tales. It's put together by a woman who is she's really a travel facilitator. Or a cultural organizer of cultural festivals with a strong interest in fairy tales. So it's not, you know, so she's having some people there, some psychology people who don't know about fairy tales. She has some writers there who write children's books, who don't know much about psychology. So I'm not sure exactly how it's going to develop, but it was certainly great to go. And it was very interesting to see Sintra. You know, to see there are places in the world that develop as resort places for the creative class. In India, I would say Dharamsala. You know, the Tibetan places where Tibetan people are staying, because there you have many foreigners there who come not just to study Tibetan culture, but you know, people come from Europe and give workshops in ancient French tapestry making. It becomes a place where people just, you know, congregate and teach and learn various aspects of culture. So Sintra has become a place like that. Does that begin to answer the question, Tricia? Yeah.
That brings me to my question. One of the things that I've been mulling over is, we speak about storytelling therapy, there is metaphor therapy, there is fairy tale therapy. There seems to be a lot of overlap, obviously. So are there clear definitions of all these types of therapy?
Did you see I sent an email, I think yesterday, with replying to this question, and you know, I did it in a doc file which was attached to the email. Did you have a chance to open that doc file and read it?
Your feedback on my questions, I think that I read.
Yes. So I defined, you know, these different things. Storytelling therapy, to me, is an umbrella term which includes all forms of therapy and self-development approaches that involve narrative psychology. Narrative psychology is a field within psychology which thinks about, how stories affect our mind, how our mind uses stories, and then there are these different fields already developing. One is called narrative therapy, which especially has developed in Australia. It seems to be especially about becoming more aware of one's own resiliency and coping mechanisms, and reframing one's past and present and future in terms of celebrating and developing those coping mechanisms. There's a field called narrative medicine, developed especially by some people at Columbia University in New York, which is all about training medical personnel and caregivers to listen to patients and to encourage patients to compose stories about their illness and recovery. So, so there are various types of storytelling therapy, and some of them involve writing, like bibliotherapy. Bibliotherapy means from a book. So that means reading poetry and other forms of literature, maybe also writing. But storytelling, of course, involves speaking and listening. And there are therapeutic aspects of just the social aspect of speaking and listening with other people. So I like to include the term storytelling, but personally I hope that storytelling therapy can include all the forms of story-related therapy. And metaphor, as I mentioned in my response, metaphor is a key aspect of art. Art is metaphor. So all the arts use metaphors, including written, spoken. So metaphor therapy is part of it. So Samia, you were thinking you want to do a research question about all of this, but my response was, this is also abstract.
Yes.
How can we make it, how can we, what can we do? Do you have an idea of what to do in order to make it something more, less abstract?
No, I have not put I actually didn't see your response. I somehow missed that mail. So let me go to it. And yes, I agree. It is very abstract. I did think it was too big and too broad. But still, perhaps that is the beginning for me to go deeper and try to find out what would be my the question that is there in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, these things will be relevant to the person or persons you're going to practice this method with. So you could perhaps combine these two projects of seeing a client and also doing a research essay about the process. Okay, a couple words about this essay about becoming oneself, a goal in Carl Jung's conception of therapy. His whole approach is to summon aspects from within oneself, to invoke, to summon, to give voice to get at, to get a grasp on, to unearth, to excavate, to incarnate, and express elements of one's unconscious. And elements of one's unconscious may also be elements of the collective unconscious, in which case they would be called archetypes. Okay, so we want to do various activities with our clients and with ourselves to help bring all this, bring it all up. And by the way, as you might have noticed, we have not been following the schedule exactly. But we will be getting to at least two of the topics that are mentioned there. One is storytelling therapy and drawing. I'll include some readings about that, and also, well, the two drawing activities that I'm working with is one is drawing a tree, which is a metaphor for oneself. Have any of you ever done that in a visual art therapy context?
Yes.
Drawn a tree? Okay, so we'll borrow that from visual art therapy. What it is you draw a tree. The roots are your past, your parents, your grandparents, your community, and the place where you grew up. The trunk is yourself, especially now, and then the branches and leaves and fruits are the things that you're producing and hope to produce in the future. So people can, as they draw that, it can be purely images, they can add words if they like, but it's a very good way to review one's life story. You can also encourage people especially to think about their coping mechanisms and their different personality traits and where they got them from, if they feel they inherited that trait from anyone. So that's one visual activity. And then another one, which I'll give a reading about, is something called the 6-part story making method. 6PSM, 6-part story method, which has been publicized especially by an Israeli psychologist, but it's really based on the work of Joseph Campbell, his hero story. But this psychologist uses it as a way to assess people's coping mechanisms. A lot of psychologists seem to be interested in coping mechanisms. You know, why some people break and other people don't. Why some people commit suicide and other people don't. So the 6-part method is that you divide a paper into 6 rectangles, typically by folding it in half vertically and then twice horizontally, so you have 6 rectangles. And then his method is in the first, I'll send this by email, so you don't try to remember it all now, but in the first square you draw a character. And you're asked to decide, does the character have a mission? Does the character want something? And then in this next square next to it, what obstacles come up along the way? And then the third one is, what resources does the character have? What friends, what family, what helpers? And then the next is, how does the character overcome the obstacles? Or maybe I have it out of order. You know, maybe the first one is the character and the mission. The second one is the friends and allies. The third one is the obstacles. Then the next one is overcoming the obstacles. And the last one is what happens at the end. Maybe I skipped one. But it seems to work for a lot of people, a lot of therapists and a lot of clients. The therapist kind of talks them through it, and along the way they draw the images and make a sort of comic book, or what's the word in cinema when they make a storyboard. Personally, I feel it's asking a client to make up too much. It puts too much pressure on a client to have to make this stuff up, I feel. So when I do it, I stress more when we look at the character, what does she look like? What is she wearing? What about her hair? What about her environment? What is she holding? How does she seem to feel? What are her facial expressions? And really get into the character and her environment and her relationship with her environment before asking the client to figure out, you know, what's the problem and what's the solution. But there are different variations on this, and it is a drawing activity in the sense that at least this psychologist really recommends that the client draw this instead of just visualize it in her head or write it down in words. The idea being is that when we draw, sometimes things come up from the unconscious more. But, you know, I think you could just as easily ask a client to visualize it and compose it in her mind. So this kind of thing could be used to help a client make up a healing story for herself. But I always feel when we don't want to force people to be creative or ask them to be creative or put them on the spot. Many times people, in my experience, just say, I don't know. I don't know what she wants. I don't know what the problem is. So that's why I suggest spending more time on just feeling her out, in relation to her environment. So those are two aspects of drawing: storytelling therapy and art. And then also I have a couple of readings, and I think we should dedicate a session to the physical aspect, right? Either last week or the week before, we did some physical actions. So I especially because about a month from now, I'm going to give a workshop purely about physical behavior and storytelling therapy. I'd like to concentrate on that for a week with readings. Okay, before we close the session, would somebody, aspects of the storytelling revival in India, and also an article by somebody else, by Ruth Stoddard, called Therapy with Fairy Tales. Did anyone have a chance to look at either of those?
Yeah, I went through Ruth Stoddard's.
How do you feel about it?
Well, a lot of it went over my head because I'm just getting a feel of fairy tale, the length and breadth of fairy tales itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have any comments right now. I'll send it across.
Maybe look at it again, and I'll also go over it and try to summarize in a simpler way what she's doing. Maybe next week, if we have time, we'll run through the fairy tale that she's working with. I
have one problem in this. It's just that, please don't mistake me. It's, the fairy tales are all very Western in their themes and motives. So I get little. I feel somehow I cannot relate to them.
Okay. Well, we won't spend too much time on it. One reason for this, I think I've mentioned, is that it's the Western fairy tale is coming out of the situation where goddess worship was outlawed, and so goddess lore went into these fairy tales. In India, that didn't happen. So in India, most stories that have something supernatural or magical in them, they refer to actual goddesses and gods, and they are not fairy tales, they are religious stories, devotional stories. And it would be an insult to call them fairy tales. But there are some stories. You know that story, you've probably heard me tell it, of the flowering tree, about the girl who her fingertips turned into flowers?
Yes. Yes.
Wouldn't you call that a fairy tale?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so there are some Indian stories that involve some magic or supernatural without referring to any particular divine figure, and do involve a good character who suffers. But yes, I hear what you're saying. It's true. Fairy tales, they don't come from the USA. They don't, for the most part, come from India. They really come from the countries of Europe and that area that converted to Christianity. So yeah, if it doesn't, in workshops in the USA, especially multi-session ones, which I assisted Laura Sims, or I witnessed Laura Sims lead many times, she has everyone come with one of their favorite fairy tales, and each person works on that fairy tale for 2 sessions or a week or whatever it is. In India, I found it's much more to the point to invite people to think about their favorite characters and episodes from the epics, from the Mahabharata or the story of Ram. That's much more an Indian thing. And of course, the animal fables most of them are from India in the international collection of, at this point, there's a global set of animal fables that children all over the world are exposed to. especially in the middle and upper class. Most of those animal fables come from India, from the Panchatantra, the Jataka tales, even Aesop's fables. It's said that most of them come from India. Then there's the fairy tales. Most of them come from Europe, Scandinavia, and the Slavic countries. So different parts of the world have contributed to the global collection of stories. Any other thoughts about anything before we hang up?
Yeah, so when we work with the metaphors, are we going to do a bit of Susan Perrot's methodology?
Yes, why don't you briefly explain her methodology?
She takes, the situation is very important. The problem situation is defined, and a metaphor is related to that problem, and a story is created around the metaphor, which usually ends in a relief being gained by the person who listens to the story, because the character goes through that, the whole story arc, and reaches a kind of a solution to the problem that they have faced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
But
I
a very
think,
powerful metaphor is used in the story, and that's something that is very interesting, because if we are looking at creating a inspiring story, then will that could help us in creating these stories for ourselves.
yes. So I think, we need to have a conversation about what are metaphors, why are they useful, how can they be useful. I think we should talk about that.
Okay.
But certainly metaphors are an essential part of story making. Any other thoughts?
I wanted to mention one thing. You mentioned that fairy tales often deal with someone having a dream and the dream eventually coming true. And that's true, but there are a couple of other types of narratives in fairy tales, and one of them is a quest narrative, where the character's quest does not result in what he originally quested for, and yet he learns something along the way that's valuable to him, and he receives something different from what he originally questioned for, and somehow finds it better or different in some way than what he originally quested for. Finds that somehow more satisfying or differently satisfying. That's a different kind of quest story than one where he ends up with what he started with, and there are fairy tales that fit into that category.
Certainly. And there also are quest, let me just interrupt for a second, there are also quest stories that are not fairy tales. Epics in general tend to be quest stories. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure, of course there are. And the other one is there's chaos narratives, where we see characters that just go through chaos one right after the other. And generally, though, the teller or the narrator or the author, whoever they may be, they provide some moral or some lesson or some outcome in which the person going through the chaos comes to some kind of resolution. They find some kind of answer or some kind of peace, or they reach some kind of turning point in which they've learned something from the chaos, and they're able to move on, or they're able to resign themselves and proceed with their life, or come to peace at the end of their life, or something like that. A chaos narrative.
Great.
There are a lot of fairy tales and other kinds of tales that fit into that category too.
Please bring to our attention a particular chaos fairy tale that you like, and it sounds like you might be near creating a chaos story, either for yourself or in general. So either of those things, please do.
Yeah, well, I wrote one a while back, but we'd be in discussion, so maybe I can mention it another time.
Well, yeah, if you wrote it, if you'd like, please send it to us.
Okay.
Amazing. I think
Okay.
that also gives an idea to look at different fairy tales and identify the pattern, the theme in different fairy tales. That would be
Identify what?
different patterns and themes.
Patterns and themes.
Themes, so that
Yes.
it gives us a sense of putting together and probably even finding categories for ourselves.
Yes.
So that would
Again, let's define fairy tale as one type of folk tale. A folk tale being a story that's created by a community and passed down orally, and keeping in mind that there are also literary fairy tales which individual authors write. But a real fairy tale is coming from the oral community and the oral tradition, and it has some sort of magic or supernatural element in it. I mean, there are many folk tales, like the one I just told about the woman who forges the letter. That has no magic or supernatural, but it's a traditional story. It's a folk tale. So folk tales that do have some sort of magic or supernatural, we're calling them fairy tales. But if that magic or supernatural is associated with any particular divine figure, any god or goddess, we cannot call it a fairy tale, because then it's a devotional story, which we have to give more respect to by acknowledging that some people consider it a historical story. So we can't insult it we can't hurt their feelings by saying, oh, it's just a fairy tale. Okay?
Thank you, everyone.
Great, okay. So we have recorded, and I'm going to end the recording now if I can figure out how to do it. Just 1 second. Stop recording. Okay.